Hello and welcome. In this presentation, I'm going to take a critical look at what I call the top 10 myths of the sexual revolution. My primary aim here is to defend and uphold biblical sexuality to Christian believers of all ages. It won't be enough to overwhelm a committed ideologue. That can be done, just not in 30 minutes. What do I mean by sexual revolution? In its essence, the negation of God's design for marriage, sex, and children. Within the biblical paradigm, which has been reflected in almost all civilizations throughout history, we begin with marriage as the central institution. Sex takes place only within marriage, and children occur only as a result of sex within marriage. Fix this image in your mind. Marriage is at the top of the hierarchy. This worked well for many thousands of years. Any deviation from this paradigm led to predictably bad consequences. If you've read Carl Trueman, you know that there is a long and distinguished philosophical history behind contemporary notions of sexuality. The actual expression sexual revolution was coined by Wilhelm Reich. Reich was a successor to Freud, who ran his clinic in Vienna throughout the 1920s. In 1939, he immigrated to New York to join the New School for Social Research. Throughout his career, Reich advanced a number of very strange ideas, particularly pertaining to human sexuality. If you read up on him, you might find them quite entertaining, but save that for another time. Because of his extravagant health claims and disturbing connections with sexual abuse, Reich was pursued by the FDA and eventually died in prison. In his final years, he became increasingly delusional, if not overtly psychotic. Let me just summarize by saying that none of Reich's ideas survive in modern mainstream science. What we think of as the sexual revolution really took off in the 1960s, and I would contend that popular culture was a much more potent driving force than delusional Austrian psychotherapists. Let me elaborate on that. The sexual revolution severed traditional relationships between sex, marriage, and children. We could say it began with rupturing the tie between sex and children, enabled by the pill in the 1960s. This was enabled by advancing technology and the Griswold decision in the U.S. Supreme Court. What it meant was that people could engage in intercourse without worrying about the natural consequence, dramatically lowering the cost of sex, especially for women, but men too. And if contraception did fail or was just too inconvenient, then you always had abortion. At its peak, that was about 1.5 million a year just in the US. It's much lower now. Over 85% are among unmarried women. Next came the separation of sex from marriage, driven by pop culture as well as shoddy scholarship, claiming that non-marital sex was healthy, normal, and free of any consequence. Finally came the rupture between marriage and children. Now, illegitimacy is not the only cause. We mustn't overlook divorce, which rose rapidly in the late 20th century with a nationwide move toward no-fault divorce and increasing social acceptance. There's another side to stage one. Technology not only made it possible to have sex without children, it made it possible to have children without sex. So instead of marriage, sex is at the top of the hierarchy. Some sexual relationships lead to or begin with marriage, but most do not. Children are usually within marriage, but often outside marriage, and thanks to the fertility industry, don't even require sex. If you've read Brave New World, written 90 years ago, Huxley foretold all three stages. In his future dystopia, marriage is eliminated, and the break between sex and children was absolute. In that context, you might find this quote from Huxley revealing. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. So Huxley was pretty transparent about his motivations, but even in writing the book, he wasn't able to put lipstick on that pig. His imaginary future was a dystopia. Some Christians are skeptical of science in general, usually the ones who don't know much about it. For reasons we don't need to go into, the relationship between science and faith can be complicated. Now, the sexual revolutionaries confidently claim that science is on their side. But not only is science not on their side, it increasingly affirms the biblical view of human sexuality as the optimal pathway to human flourishing. I'm going to present this as the top 10 myths. This isn't a Letterman kind of list. They're organized more by topic than priority. But I'll offer my opinion as to which is the worst. It might not be what you expect. So let's proceed to our first myth. Gender is a social construct. What does that mean? This is a claim that there are no intrinsic differences between men and women other than the physical ones, that everything pertaining to gender norms and roles is dictated by society. The idea emerged during what we call second wave feminism. First wave feminism was the movement starting in the late 1700s advancing the empowerment of women and legal equality. Second wave feminism came along in the mid-20th century. One of its more noteworthy proponents was Simone de Beauvoir, the girlfriend of existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Simone is well known for declaring, "On ne naît pas femme, on la devient," which translates, "We're not born women, we become one." She was denying that anything related to femininity was biological or present at birth. You might note that this flatly contradicts the axioms of contemporary transgenderism, which define one's gender according to those same external stereotypes. Now, in the mid-20th century, that might have been a workable hypothesis, even if it sounded a bit fishy. But in the later 20th century, neuroscience research exploded. The 1990s were designated the decade of the brain by the NIH, and that research found that there are concrete, persistent, and pervasive differences between male and female cognition. Male children really are more aggressive, more systems-oriented, and more inclined towards risk-taking. Female children really are more empathetic, less aggressive, and risk-averse. The complete list is much longer. But those are averages. There's no dividing wall that reliably separates one from the other, but a lot of overlap. Probably the one area where there is the least overlap is sex drive, where the difference between men and women is pretty large and persistent. But far from being culturally determined, these differences begin in utero and are firmly established at birth. Even in the developing embryo, circulating testosterone causes male and female brains to develop differently, not in a way we can see structurally like on an MRI, but in the way that they are wired. If you want a good, thorough read on this topic, I highly recommend Why Gender Matters by Leonard Sachs, now in a second edition. But this doesn't completely negate de Beauvoir. It's not an either-or. Some gender roles and behaviors, even how people dress, are culturally influenced. Virtually all modern Bible scholars agree that Paul's extended riff on head coverings speaks to a social construct, not a moral concern. This cuts both ways, though. If in olden days women were pressured to act like women, now there's a lot of cultural pressure to make women act more like men. Now, how is that any different? I know some people bristle at the phrase, but you could pretty much say the science on this is settled. The January 2017 issue of the Journal of Neuroscience Research was completely devoted to articles reviewing the neuroscientific evidence of innate male-female differences. In his introduction, journal editor Larry Cahill wrote, "The notion that sex matters fundamentally, powerfully, and pervasively for all of neuroscience, not just for reproduction, is an idea whose time indeed has come." Well, we might say that idea came thousands of years ago, but better late than never. Is this common knowledge? Of course not. Most of the media and education establishment are still living in the 70s. Myth number 10 is pretty easy to knock off, so let's forge ahead. Number 9 in our countdown, intercourse between consenting adults is harmless. So according to the prevailing secular narrative, it's morally neutral, harmless, possibly even healthy. The only constraint is mutual consent. This idea really took off in the 60s and has become the official position of the political left and most of the entertainment industry. In TV and movies, most romantic relationships end up in bed. Apart from a few rare exceptions like Fatal Attraction, when are there ever any negative consequences? Well, let's do a reality check. Well, consequence number one should be pretty obvious. No matter what they say, contraception, even if used, is far from 100% successful. Occasionally, intercourse still results in God's intended outcome. Number two, sexually transmitted diseases. This April, the CDC reported that 2020 was a record year for gonorrhea and syphilis, even in the middle of a COVID lockdown. Even the CDC recommends limiting the number of sexual partners. Make that 1 or 0, and STDs cease to be an issue. Number three, the emotional consequences. There's a complex and unavoidable neurochemical response to sexual intercourse that impacts how one feels and how one behaves in the future. Intercourse results in a dopamine hit, which, as you know, activates the brain's reward centers. Whatever you do that releases dopamine, your brain wants to keep doing more of it. That's true for gambling, illicit drugs, birdieing on the 18th hole, or having sex. Sex also stimulates the production of oxytocin. This is popularly known as the cuddle hormone and is part of God's design to facilitate emotional bonding between father and mother, or mother and child. Vasopressin has a similar effect in men. The brain doesn't differentiate between a lifelong monogamous partnership and a one-night stand, at least not initially. However, the brain is also highly malleable. It learns and adapts. So over time, it adapts to whatever lifestyle you pursue. Now, this becomes problematic if someone later decides to enter a monogamous relationship after years of promiscuity. It's like trying to make a sudden course correction on an ocean liner. Joe McElhaney has compiled an excellent review of the neuroscience surrounding this subject here on your right. Lastly, there are the social consequences. Well, if one of the partners happens to be married to somebody else, obviously it's a problem. Well, how about if they're cohabiting, just going steady? An awful lot of conflict can be connected to something that's supposed to be harmless. As we continue our countdown, we come to myth number 8. Marriage is just a piece of paper. Now, this works like an ace of spades for men in cohabiting relationships who want to justify not marrying their partner. Most women, on the other hand, are not quite so thrilled with this line. But imagine for a moment it's true. Are there really no differences between married couples and cohabiting couples? Well, as you may suspect, the data shows otherwise. If it didn't, I wouldn't have it on this list. Here's an excellent review from Linda Waite and Maggie Gallagher. It was written around the turn of the millennium, so it's over 20 years old, but the data has really held up and continues to strengthen. Linda Waite was a social science researcher who studied marriage over many decades. Even by then, there was a wealth of data on the difference between cohabiting relationships and marriage. Couples who were married exhibited much higher levels of commitment to one another, both in their personal lives and specifically in the area of sex. They were more focused on the life of their partner and more concerned with their partner's interest. People in a marriage relationship, especially women, were safer and at lower risk of abuse or violent death. This also extends to death from illness. Men who are married can expect a significantly greater life expectancy. And of course, married couples were consistently more financially secure. On the other hand, cohabiting partners exhibited much lower levels of commitment toward one another. Their relationships were far less stable and of much shorter duration. Partners in a cohabiting relationship are less dependent upon the other person and less interested in their partner's life. In addition to all that, they are also inherently more violent with greater risk of domestic abuse. So it turns out that cohabitation is substantially inferior to marriage across a wide range of parameters. It's a whole lot more than a piece of paper. Throughout history, most people understood that. In position 7, we have the sexual revolution was a boon for women. Well, how do they justify this? Well, the claim is that it enabled women to pursue rich lives and fulfilling careers without the burdens of domestic responsibility and early motherhood. Even better, women were free to have sex whenever and with whomever they choose, just like men. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. There's little evidence that's what most women want, but I can't speak for them. Of course, to advance this argument, they must assume that financial and legal equality with men was part and parcel of the sexual revolution. But this is what we call an equivocation fallacy. There was never a moral argument against legal equality for women, and support for this principle was widespread across Western society. This was what we classify under the term first wave feminism. The sexual revolution fell under the category of second wave feminism, and that was not a natural progression, but a complete paradigm shift. As a consequence of the sexual revolution, young women today are marrying older and less likely ever to be married. With the decreased chance of marriage ever, there's a decreased chance of motherhood. Even just delaying the age of marriage leads to decreased fertility and reduced family size. While women are doing much better in measures like sports or business or college graduation rates, happiness has not come as part of the package. In fact, researchers have documented a decline in women's happiness. In 2009, the American Economic Journal published The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness by Stevenson, Betsy, and Wolfers. They documented that over a span of 35 years, women's happiness declined both in absolute terms and relative to men throughout the industrialized world. So why did they call it a paradox? Because everyone took it for granted that there was no downside to the sexual revolution and that happiness derived from money and power. Today's women are more likely to be depressed, more likely to experience anxiety, and less satisfied with their life situations. Let's visualize this data in a couple of charts. In this graphic from the Institute for Family Studies, we see that the percentage of 25 to 50-year-olds who have never been married, in the dark blue, has risen from 9% in 1970 to a whopping 35% today. The number currently married, in green, has dropped from nearly 90% to barely over 50%. What this chart doesn't show is that there is also a strong economic component to this. The percentage of high-income adults who've never married is in the low 20s, but the percentage of low-income adults who've never married is over 40%. There are many reasons for this. Mark Regnerus has, I think, the best grasp of what's going on. In his work, he describes how while sex has become cheap, marriage is now very expensive. Now, when he says marriage has become expensive, he means not just economically, but in the expectations of society and of potential partners. Because women are marrying later and less likely ever to be married, they are having fewer children than they would like. You can see in this chart, based on the data from the General Social Survey, that there is a significant gap between the number of children women say they want to have in the top line and the number of children they probably will have in the bottom line. In fact, the gap is presently the highest it has been in 40 years. Even by the beginning of this timeline, the fertility rate was already low. This chart doesn't show the dramatic plunge in fertility from 1960 to 1975 after abortion and the pill became widely available. For much of the last 40 years, birth rates have been below replacement levels. It wasn't just abortion and the pill, though. Along with the sexual revolution came declining marriage rates and a culturally sanctioned narcissism that encourages a perpetual adolescence that's basically incompatible with parenthood. Now, people can believe whatever they want, but the reality is that having children is a pretty high priority for most women and pretty foundational to their long-term happiness. Not all of them realize it, and it need not be true for all women. But based on this brief overview, we can see that the sexual revolution hasn't exactly been all wine and roses for women in Western society. But that's just half the story. Men aren't doing so great either, but that's another story for another day. Well, I'm not even halfway through, but already some of the foundational assumptions behind the secular sexual narrative don't seem to be holding up that well. Let's move to number 6 in our countdown. Chastity and monogamy are oppressive. If you guess that this had shades of Sigmund Freud, you'd be guessing correctly. They say that when your only tool is a hammer, the whole world is a nail. For Sigmund Freud, sex was his hammer. He attributed all kinds of psychiatric disorders, real and imagined, to what he called repressed sexuality. As you probably know, though, although Freud has some good insights into the human subconscious, most of his work was complete bunk. He didn't do research so much as he simply made things up, and his theories have not held up well in the past 50 years. Well, people don't really read Freud, but they do watch TV and go to movies. And inevitably, the narrative follows the same pattern. Characters committed to chastity or monogamy are repressed, judgmental, boring, and generally dysfunctional. Or they're hypocrites and closet libertines. Not that that hasn't happened, of course. Producers and writers love to pretend that sex is harmless and healthy. The sex drive should never be suppressed. I think I've already given a few good reasons why maybe it ought to be suppressed, and there are more coming up. But let's take that myth as a hypothesis and go with it. What are the alternatives to monogamy and chastity? Well, basically, you're left with free, unconstrained sex and the elimination of marriage. It's not as if this hasn't been tried before. It was partially operational in Imperial Rome, at least if you were a male member of the ruling class. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, radicals sought to abolish marriage and the nuclear family and set out to do exactly that. There was a resulting explosion in sexually transmitted diseases, abortion, and rape. The experiment was a disaster and was quickly brought to a halt. But when marriage and monogamy are really examined, I think they turn out pretty well. The research consistently shows that married people are happier, healthier, and even enjoy better sex lives. Social groups with a high percentage of married couples and intact nuclear families are more stable, with lower crime rates, higher employment, and greater prosperity. On the right-hand side of my screen, you see From Shame to Sin by Kyle Harper. Harper is a professor of classics at the University of Oklahoma, and in this book he described how things worked in first century Rome. Male aristocrats ruled the roost. Upper-class women had some property rights. Any women further down, which was most of them, had no rights, including the right not to be raped by their owners or another powerful male. Christianity didn't impose a patriarchy. It invaded the patriarchy and overturned it. The only losers in the biblical arrangement are male sexual predators. So let's go on and talk about sexual predators. The activists of the sexual revolution don't deny that sexual predators exist. They simply argue that their ideology is not to blame. So how do they account for their existence? Well, I saw a documentary on the Harvey Weinstein scandal, and it was pretty good up until the end. They asked about solutions, and it seemed everybody's answer was to get more women producers in Hollywood. It was all just a matter of unfair power distribution. Well, I don't have any problem with having more female producers in Hollywood, but there still would be male producers, so you wouldn't be eliminating the problem. And how does that help the 99% of victims who are not wealthy, talented, and privileged starlets? How does it help the waitresses and hotel maids? On top of that, all their victims weren't always female. Anyone here heard of Kevin Spacey? Besides the issue of power, they bring up the matter of consent. Well, of course, consent's pretty important, but it's not exactly a Boolean quantity, meaning either 1 or 0. There are degrees of consent and situations in which it seems very ambiguous or contingent, or one or both partners is under the influence of mind-altering substances. And of course, there's that perennial bête noire, what leftists term toxic masculinity. Well, they actually have a point there, but their error lies in equating toxic masculinity with traditional masculinity. That's another equivocation fallacy. Only a lunatic would see any connection between raping women and declining to ordain them. But let's keep this toxic masculinity on the table for a moment. So you all know about the Me Too movement. You've heard about the sex abuse scandals from the Boy Scouts and the Roman Catholic Church. The data shows that there was a spike in abuse cases during the 70s and 80s. Well, what's significant about the 70s and 80s? These were the decades immediately following the sexual revolution. But if you really want to know what causes sexual predators, you got to study the predators. Well, I have good news for you. That's been done. In 1991, Neil Malamuth developed what he called the confluence model of sexual predator formation. He initially identified 2 elements in their development. The first was misogyny, a general contempt toward women. So yeah, toxic masculinity, it does exist. And it's nothing we should be defensive about. Let's just be clear about what it is and what it isn't. The second was casual sexual orientation. Now, casual sexual orientation has nothing to do with your choice of partner. It describes one attitude towards sex itself, whether it's deep and meaningful and only within a loving, committed relationship, or whether it's trivial and something to be gratified whenever the opportunity arises. In other words, the exact opposite of a biblical position. Well, it turns out that both of these are strongly correlated with the formation of sexual predators. It took quite some time for the third pillar to be identified, but in the last decade, research has conclusively demonstrated that pornography is another major contributor to the formation of sexual predators, which takes us down to number 4 in our countdown. Pornography doesn't hurt anyone. In the last few decades, pornography has become ubiquitous, and that's largely because of the internet. Conservatives have always opposed pornography because of the moral implications and often tried to pass or preserve legislation keeping it out of the marketplace. Unfortunately, this continued to be struck down by courts on the basis of First Amendment arguments. Intuitively, we figured out that it really can't be that good for you, but it proved to be really hard, showing that there was a direct connection between pornography and sexual misconduct. This argument has been going on for a long time, but in the last 10 years, the evidence for the danger of pornography has become very compelling. It might be that the early studies of pornography didn't show that much of an impact, because by current standards, it was really pretty tame. The Playboy of 50 years ago has very little connection to the hardcore sort of stuff that is readily available today to your average 10-year-old with a smartphone. Today we know a lot more about pornography, and what we know is damning. I've already mentioned some of the neurobiology behind sex, and everything that I said about sex applies to pornography. You get the same dopamine effects, and that which generates dopamine can lead to addiction. There is a strong link between pornography and male impotence. Like any other addictions, it often develops at higher and higher levels of stimulation are needed to achieve the same effect. Unfortunately for some of these people, real human females can't compete with the intensity of arousal they get for the pornography they consume. Clearly, this is going to have an impact on relationships, especially if the consumer of pornography is married or in a long-term romantic partnership. In the area of sexual economics, this is the cheapest sex of all. If they can gratify their sex drive this way, men needn't expend the effort to court a woman. Some simply drop out of the marriage market altogether, skewing the odds even further against women. From its earliest days, the pornography industry was based on the exploitation and abuse of vulnerable women. Today, it has only grown worse. But building upon the previous myth, it is now firmly established that pornography has a causal connection to the formation of sexual predators. There is a large body of research showing that young people exposed to pornography have more lifetime sexual partners, mix alcohol and drugs with sex, engage in riskier sex, and are more likely to be sex offenders. Here's a book and a website where you can access a wealth of scientific data on the matter. People are just beginning to clue in. Here's a Saturday essay from the London Times just a few months ago. This is a screenshot from the website Your Brain on Porn. It looks like they have a lot of data, but what you see here is really just a table of contents. So after several decades of research, we now know that pornography really is bad for you. Wow, who would have thunk it? These aren't ranked in order, but to me this is the biggest lie. The children will be fined. Well, if I wanted to be snarky, I could add the qualifier, those children allowed to be born, but we don't want to be snarky now, do we? Throughout the decades following the sexual revolution, many of us expressed concern about the impact upon children. The continued refrain was that children are resilient. In fact, they will be just fine. Well, they're not fine. Now, there are a lot of constituencies that really want this to be true. People who are divorcing or wanted to make it easier didn't want to feel burdened with guilt over its effects upon children. Another large category consisted of those who wanted to destigmatize unmarried childbearing. Of course, that's always a delicate situation, and while we don't want to make matters worse with our rhetoric, denying the evident harm serves no one. You might think that in this department we're just following the lead of our sophisticated European allies, but that's unfortunately not the case. Just like the US has much more liberal laws pertaining to abortion and divorce, we lead the world in the number of children who live without both parents. That's really not something where you want to be number one. Let's look at the impact. Stacey Manning came out with this outstanding piece of work. Katie has a long history as a children's rights advocate. She also has a personal connection as her parents divorced and her mother subsequently entered into a same-sex relationship. With the sexual revolution, everything is about gratifying the selfish desires and fantasies of adults. Children are treated as commodities. Both divorce and extramarital pregnancy result in children being deprived of one or the other parent. Now, sometimes that's tragic and unavoidable, but there's a sizable contingent of activists who see nothing wrong with these institutions. In so doing, they ignore a vast spectrum of research showing how hurtful they are to children. Kids raised without a father are at increased risk of dropping out of school, behavioral disorders, mental disorders, incarceration, poverty, physical and sexual abuse, early pregnancy, and almost every other measure of social pathology. Kids raised without a mother don't fare all that well either, but it is much less common. Now, thanks to technology, we have an increasing population of kids who are conceived outside of sex by either sperm donation, egg donation, embryo donation, or surrogate pregnancy. This leads to a population of children who are permanently estranged from their genetic parents, and in the case of surrogacy, even their birth mother. The safest place in the world for any child is to be at home with his or her biological parents. Any departure from this in any direction raises the likelihood of physical and even sexual abuse. The most dangerous situation is when a child shares a household with an unrelated adult male. In one series, the risk of abuse was actually 50 times higher. Both divorce and extramarital pregnancy lead to the deprivation of either a mother or a father. Katie Foss made an excellent point in the book. She objects to the use of the word parenting because it consists really of two separate and irreplaceable components, mothering and fathering, and kids need both. But it gets worse. In same-sex partnerships, that's not a bug, but a feature. I would gather that most of you have had mothers or fathers, and though you may not have known them or lived with them throughout your upbringing, but if you were lucky enough to grow up with both parents, which one would you have given up for a duplicate of the other? Would you have given up your father for a second mother? Would you give up your mother for a second father? Do you seriously believe they were interchangeable? Well, people truly do believe this, but it's despite all the evidence and the universal sum of human experience. Remember I said men aren't doing so great either? Well, half of all children are male, and this is where the problems begin. The children are not fine, and the sexual revolution is to blame. So continue our countdown, we come to myth number 2. There is no meaningful difference between homosexuality and heterosexuality. Now, this is a really sensitive subject, and for better or worse, LGBTQ issues have consumed most of the oxygen over the last 30 years. Well, what do I mean here? I mean the narrative that they're socially, biologically, and morally equivalent, like height or hair color, or right-handed versus left-handed, even something to be celebrated. Now, it's hard to know how many people seriously believe this, probably a lot. I think it's fair to say that it's a foundational assumption in Western pop culture. Considering that homosexuals are regularly portrayed as helpless and powerless victims, and they have at times been really badly treated, there's a lot of sympathy going in their direction. Some people really want this to be true. Now I'm going to pass on the moral judgments. What are the basic differences from a social, medical, and biological standpoint? To be clear, even though we lump them in the same category, there are big differences between male and female homosexuality in psychology and plasticity and in sexual practices. Mostly I'm just going to talk about male homosexuality. Point number 1, it's pretty obvious that male homosexuals do not engage in what could be considered safe and healthy physiologic sexual intercourse. The rectal wall is much thinner and less elastic, lacks the immune defenses of a woman's vagina, harbors dangerous pathogens, and ends in a sphincter, which is essential to proper functioning but an impediment to misuse. This is one reason why a 2021 report from New Zealand published in the British Medical Journal found that relative to heterosexuals, gay and bisexual men faced a 57-fold increased risk of gonorrhea, a 163-fold increased risk of syphilis, and a 348-fold increased risk of HIV/AIDS. But another contributing factor to the much higher rate of sexually transmitted diseases is that gay men have many more partners than their heterosexual counterparts. In a 2014 survey from the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, only 11% of heterosexual men report more than 20 lifetime partners, compared to 45% of gay men. At the low end of the range, 74% of heterosexual men reported less than 10 lifetime partners, but only 34% of gay men. Now, it would be an error to conclude from this that homosexuals have a higher sex drive. In fact, this would be predicted according to the theory of sexual economics advanced by Baumeister and Regnerus. While in heterosexual encounters, females act as gatekeepers, in male-to-male relationships, the gatekeeper effect is eliminated. There's also a strong cultural component. During the AIDS epidemic, levels of promiscuity dropped precipitously, but in recent decades, it has rebounded within the gay population, according to a 2019 paper from the CDC. Another obvious point that deserves emphasis is that same-sex relationships are incapable of bringing new little humans into existence. Yeah, there are workarounds, but this is done for the benefit of adults, certainly not the children. No child should be brought into this world purposefully knowing that child won't have either a mother or a father, but it's happening through artificial insemination or surrogacy. Katie Foss discusses this at length and has collected many heartbreaking stories of kids raised in these situations. It's well known that within the gay population, both male and female, there are much higher rates of depression, drug addiction, abuse, and suicide. The simplest explanation would be that it's just a naturally unhealthy state, and these are what we in the medical community would call comorbidities. But there's a competing hypothesis that blames society and those who don't accept it. This is called the minority stress theory, and of course is popular among those who want to deny any basic difference. It's certainly possible that this is a contributing factor, but there's no way it can explain all the differences. And it goes against one of the most consistent principles in human psychology, that nothing ever reduces to one simple cause. In nearly all studies, claims of discrimination are based on self-reporting or the person's perception. More than one researcher has pointed out that male homosexuals on average exhibit much higher levels of neuroticism as a core trait. And this may mean that they are just more likely to interpret routine encounters as discrimination or abuse. Why does all this matter? Because those who refuse to admit any basic difference are forced to come up with alternative explanations for differences that are really quite obvious. But let's move on to our final myth. So our final myth, that's just the way God made me. Well, that's really more of a theological statement than a scientific one. The implied claim is that if you can somehow attribute your behavior to something inborn rather than a matter of will, then you shouldn't be held morally accountable. Of course, to get there, you have to dismiss 2,000 years of Christian teaching that we are all born with a sin nature, yet morally accountable. So that really doesn't cut it. I think it's been pretty convincingly settled that science cannot define morality. This goes back to David Hume, who concluded that you can never derive an ought from an is. For guidance on theology and morality, I direct everyone to the reference on the right of my screen. Of course, in the field of medicine, we know that we are born with all sorts of things that are bad for us. While probably well over 50% of illness among American adults is directly related to lifestyle and fully preventable, that still leaves a lot of disease. Tay-Sachs disease is a genetic disorder common among Ashkenazi Jews that attacks the central nervous system. Children born with the infantile form almost never live more than 5 years, but they're also born that way. Now, you could object that Tay-Sachs disease doesn't have any moral or behavioral connotations, and you'd be right. There's a fairly long list of behavioral disorders with a strong genetic component, including ADHD, Tourette syndrome, substance abuse, and schizophrenia. No human behavior or personality trait is exclusively linked to a genetic cause. Everything represents a mixture of nature and nurture. This principle also applies in the area of human sexuality. Since that line has often been used by those seeking the normalization and acceptance of homosexuality, what does the science have to say? Are they born that way? Well, the jury's still out on that. The official position of both the American Psychiatric Association and the American Psychological Association is that the causes of same-sex attraction are unknown but probably multifactorial. Based on twin studies and genome surveys, we can say with confidence that there's no gay gene and genetics plays a small role at most. Like most human traits, same-sex attraction seems to be a combination of nature and nurture. We find, for instance, that it's slightly higher among identical twins, but in the vast majority of twin pairs, if one is gay, the other is not. There's a small birth order effect in that younger male siblings are at increased risk over older ones. But it's also very wrong to say it's a choice. That might have happened in isolated cases, but it must be extremely rare. Transgenderism is a whole nother story. Up until 2013, a person who believed that they belonged to the other sex was diagnosed as having gender identity disorder. That diagnosis disappeared in the DSM-5, but not because of any scientific breakthrough. It was an accommodation to the political environment. That isn't science. It's sloppy metaphysics. It's scientifically and logically incoherent for a biological male to claim he's ontologically a woman or vice versa. This is because of the effects of sex hormones during fetal development and the early postnatal period. A young boy, even if puberty is blocked, is already 2/3 of the way to mental manhood and can never go back. You remember those male-female differences I talked about? I only mentioned a handful out of dozens. Most present in early childhood, even infancy. Puberty is not required. But neurobiology doesn't cancel out human agency. Even among committed materialists, few are willing to go that far. We still have the ability to make choices, and because the brain is a very dynamic and adaptable organ, we have some control over what direction it travels. Golf instructors love the saying that practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. That's quite true of the brain. Every time you indulge in particular thoughts or behaviors, you're forming connections. Keep doing it and those connections grow stronger. Practice makes permanent. The reverse is also true. That's probably why the Bible has so much to say about keeping our minds pure and focused on righteousness. Paul didn't know any neurobiology, but God invented it. So let's land this plane. Here's my thesis. When it comes to sexuality, it is not Christianity that is in conflict with mainstream science. It is the prevailing cultural narrative. These issues are complex. Those opposed to Christian morality can cherry-pick data to support their own preferred narrative, and there's no way you can anticipate every objection they might raise. I have studied and written much about biases, sound thinking, the deceptive use of data, and intellectual pride. People believe all sorts of things because they want to. How do I know I'm not succumbing here? Let me give you 5 reasons. Number 1, you can look at who is on our side, all major world faiths and even many atheists, all races and many political persuasions. This isn't some quirk of white fundamentalist Christianity. Number 2, you can look at who is not on our side, highly motivated players with transparent personal agendas. Don't forget Huxley or Harvey Weinstein. Number 3, common sense. We all see the wreckage around us. How many of your friends and family have been impacted by this? Maybe all of them? Number 4, our position doesn't depend on postulating any conspiracies, assuming motives, or invisible actors. It doesn't depend on cherry-picking the evidence or taking quotes out of context. Number 5, almost all cognitive biases are self-serving. Nothing is more self-serving than the belief that you can have sex anytime you want with anyone who will. A Christian sexual ethic runs against all self-serving biases. So the myths of the sexual revolution are collapsing all around us. The tide has begun to turn. I welcome you to join the movement.